neither the communists or the nationalists complain about the deindustrialization of Manchuria. And the communists probably traded that industry for all the conventional aid that they got. And the nationalists are trading that and also outer Mongolian independence for a promise from Stalin not to aid the communists, which is a promise that he promptly breaks. So Mao starts to figure out that something is up here. So when he's on a roll in his offensives in the Civil War, there's really bitter fighting. And the real movement in the last phase, the post-1940 phase of the Chinese Civil War, is in 1948. That year, Mao just moves. And he is roaring down south, and he's about to get the Yangtze River. And Stalin's like, hey, buddy, take a break at the Yangtze. Don't exhaust yourself. And Mao ignores it. Because whereas Stalin might have wanted to keep nationalist rump states south of the Yangtze River, yielding a divided China in keeping with weakening your neighbor, Mao is not remotely interested in that. And here's my 10th example, which is the Korean War. If you look at the Korean War, the first year is a war of movement. There's up and down the peninsula. It's unbelievable how much movement there is. But then it stalemates for the last 2 years. And you think, well, what's going on? Why don't they settle the war sooner? Because both sides are taking incredible losses. Well, here's how it goes. Once China intervenes in the Korean War, and once they halt various offensives to start peace talks, the Chinese do incredible tunnel work, and probably the North Koreans as well, and build an incredible tunnel system. So it means the South Koreans and the UN forces are never going to get anywhere near the Soviet border ever again. And from that moment on, Stalin thinks he's got a low-risk, high-reward strategy where he's going to weaken the United States and delay the rise of China. So what's not to love about fighting to the last Chinese in Korea? Stalin thinks this is great. And it's going to retard Chinese development. It's also because China is so isolated by this war. It has no international friends but Russia. It's going to tie China to Russia ever more firmly and give Russia a breathing space to rebuild after World War II, while its Western enemies are wasting time in Korea. So if you put it all together, Chinese Civil War, Korean War, of Russia's on and off again aid to the different sides in the Civil War, his double dealing with both of them, and what happened with Outer Mongolia and the Manchurian industrial base, Stalin's advice to Mao to halt at the Yangtze, and then he's fighting to the last Chinese in Korea. This is all consistent with the second rule of Continental Empire, no great power neighbors. All right, once Stalin dies, finest day of his life, there's never as strong a leader in Russia again. And by this time, Mao has figured out that the Russians don't want a strong China. He has to bide his time for a while, but he understands what is going on. And Mao has a growing list of gripes. It's not only he didn't like Stalin's tributary treatment, but also Mao thinks, with his resume, that he should become the leader of international communism. And Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, it's like, no way. And Khrushchev does not have remotely Mao's resume. Mao has just put together a continent by reunifying China. That's not remotely what Khrushchev's ever been able to do. And Mao also can't stand either Khrushchev's domestic or foreign policy. Domestically, Khrushchev is all about de-Stalinization. Well, Mao doesn't like that. He's got a cult of personality. He doesn't want to do things like that. And then Khrushchev is interested in peaceful coexistence with the West, or at least nominally, whereas Mao is in the midst of the Cultural Revolution, which is based on a virulently anti-Western foreign policy. And then they're forever squabbling about who's aiding Vietnam in the North Vietnam in the Vietnam War and who's going to get credit for it. So all of that's going on. Now, Khrushchev has his own gripes about the Chinese. He looks around at the United States. The United States has got basing all over the world. Its allies allow the United States to have bases. And China has hardly any Russian bases, these leftover concession areas, and China wants them back. And Khrushchev can't understand this. And then what he really can't understand are the two Taiwan Strait crises of 1954 and 1958, where Mao starts lobbing ordnance on nationalist islands that are very close to mainland shores. And Khrushchev is apoplectic because Mao hasn't given him any advance warning. And by the way, this sort of thing could trigger some of the security clauses of the Sino-Soviet friendship treaty with nuclear follow-on effects. And then while this is going on, when Khrushchev wants to have a combined subfleet base, if we're going to take all these risks, we need to have subs in different places. Mao says, no way. And then Khrushchev is fed up and said, well, you're not going to get the plans for the atomic bomb. Okay. And the whole thing becomes public in 1960 with anger all around. And the two, Russia and China, squabbled incessantly over the Vietnam War. And the North Vietnamese were interested in getting maximum aid from both, which it did. And they begged the Chinese to allow the Russians to ship things overland through China. So the Chinese felt obliged to do it. But the terms of that overland trade were just a food for all kinds of squabbling. It just didn't end. So the story of the reversal in the balance of power between Russia and China arose from multiple factors, doesn't happen all at once. It is both a story of China's rise and of Russia's decline. And step one for China is getting its own atomic weapon, which it does in 1964, so that it can get itself free of Soviet bondage. And so this is in 1964, after they've detonated that bomb, where Mao goes, okay, there are too many places occupied by the Soviet Union. The Russians took everything they could. We have not yet presented an account for this list of stolen territory, all the territory I've shown you. We want it back. The Russians, jaw drops, panic. And the Chinese then are much more aggressive about what they consider to be their territorial rights. And there is a border war over territories, and in particular, this one island, Jumbauer-Damansky Island in the Amur River. All right, here's how riverine borders work, international ones. Under international law, the border is the thalweg, which is the center of the main channel of whatever the river is. And Russia had followed that with its European borders. Not with China. It claimed both banks of the Amur. Well, the Chinese are fed up with that, and they take Jumbau Island. And the Russians are furious, and they come to the United States, and they say, would it be okay if we nuke these people? And we're like, no. So then the Russians scratch their head, and they come back, and they go, okay, would it be okay if we use conventional weapons to blow up their nuclear stuff? And we go, no, still not okay. And Mao gets it. The one that wants to nuke you is your primary adversary. So there's a reshuffling of the primary adversaries, so that formerly the United States was the primary adversary of both China and Russia. So that would be a reason for them to cooperate. Well, now they're primary adversaries for each other, and the United States can play the swing thing with all of this. And for Russia, it's really devastating having China as an enemy, because it's going to have to deploy mechanized nuclear-armed troops all along its really long Chinese border, or Central Asia, the works. And it's already doing this with its European borders and occupying Eastern Europe, which garrison costs are significant. Imagine if this country had to put those kinds of forces on our long Canadian and Mexican borders. It'd be bankrupting, and their economy was and remains a fraction of ours. But this breaking up of the earlier version of the bromance allows the United States to play the swing role, and then we cooperate. Both Nixon and Mao think ganging up on Russia would be a good thing, and overextending Russia financially by overextending it militarily with all these armaments and things.